Hello everyone, today we talk about the Norman-Byzantine Wars, a brief introduction to a conflict lasting for essentially a couple hundred years, incarnating some of the most interesting confrontations between a Western and Eastern power in medieval times in Mediterranean, probably the expression of the Latin Germanic and the Greek Byzantine world at large. I do have here, I see, a substantial amount of videos already on Norman history. However, this mostly includes such things like the history of Normandy, properly of the Duchy, the medieval Normandy, the Anglo-Normans, as probably also the early history of, in fact, the essentially Western Frankish Kingdom of England. So there isn't too much about the Normans in general, especially in the early age. We never, for example, made a foundational video describing the basic sort of definition of what we mean by Normans, how this entangles with the Viking era, but as a matter of fact, it's much more with the Latin continental developments. We have here, I see, 9 videos already about the Siculo-Normans, which is not too bad, but we should do more about them. In fact, today's video is mostly about this. It's mostly about the Siculo-Norman Byzantine Wars. I also never made a video for that matter about the Norman conquest of southern Italy and Sicily. In part, now we will look at that. I made a video, for example, about Norman Sicily in general. There's a very brief resume of the situation. This video also aimed, obviously, to look at the broader strategic dimension of these clashes, the geographical reach, the broader setting, meaning the context of the Crusading era, the fact that the Normans were not some sort of allogen force coming out of nowhere, but in fact was at this point one of the most aggressively pronged vanguards of Romano-Frankish Europe that would become, as a matter of fact, the single greatest threat to the Byzantine Empire, even more than the Seljuks that already at this point had naturally created some problem around. But as we've seen also about a recent video made last spring, recent, by that standard, Schwerpunkt is starting to be several years old, as a matter of fact. The early Byzantine employment of Normans was something already showing the autonomy of the latter, to the point that the Byzantines got almost jealous that Balliol, John Balliol had been hired, as many other mercenaries, like from the west, would essentially be removed from his eastern Anatolian post by also the young Alexius Comnenus, not yet emperor at the time, which basically broke the dam of the actual Seljuk invasion, because the Norman garrisons that had autonomized themselves in Amasya were too much for the Byzantines, that felt them to be too threatening, but at the same time, by removing them, the Seljuks poured through. After the same Alparslan, after Manzikert, had actually been repelled a couple of times already. So it's a very complex scenario. There are so many different ways of talking the story, and again, this is not broadly about the Normans, it's mostly, again, Siculo-Norman Byzantine warfare, the main campaigns, etc. But the Normans were also a big thing in a broader Western sense. They settled pretty much very far away. They were around for quite a while, and they were essentially the purest expression of the Western Frankish elite military at this point, rather than having any other specific sort of ethnic characteristic. In fact, by Normans in this case, we really mean mostly Western Franks, surely also of Norse ancestry from the lower Seine Valley. There's no doubt about that connection, but the bulk also of them came from a broader pool, not just of Western Franks, but also of Germans, of Lombards. That's a reason why, for example, in the very heart of Sicily, right, in the very interland, there is literally a northern Italian dialect spoken from the very Lombards that the Normans settled, in fact, in the Sicilian heartland to control it. So there is also a very big spatial dimension. I am very surprised, I must say, about the sort of complete lack of interest, if you want, in the Southern Norman epopee, because it was, in a sense, at the time, the most important. I mean, we know, of course, that the longevity of the Normans, even through female line later, for example, in the same Angevin dynasty, etc., were a big deal for English history, as English history went on in a more distinctive way, whereas Southern Italy had at least the Normans just for a couple of hundred years. Then there were other, also there, in female descent, like other dynasties up until at least the Angevins and the Aragonese that had really not much to do with that. So in the moment it may seem like, we're not so interested. Normans sound mostly like something Northern European. It's also very much about England, etc. But as a matter of fact, the Siculo-Normans established essentially the single most power concentrated and de facto centralized, juridically, institutionally, administratively, country in the Latin Germanic West. Right? It was at some point the biggest power. Also later on, we've seen even just the income of the entire kingdom of Sicily at the time of Charles of Anjou. It even surpassed the one of his brothers, King Louis IX of France. So this gives you a dimension of the traumatically magnitudinal amount of power and sort of resources, extension, availability that southern Italy and Sicily as a whole had as a essentially merely Norman construction. There is also a very deep papal connection. The history of pre-Norman southern Italy is quite fascinating. Recently, as you know, I participated to a live stream on Eastern Roman history, talking exactly about, and I uploaded the same video, at least, a remake the day after on my channel about Byzantine southern Italy at the time of Basil II, which is exactly to this previous generation. That's where the Normans start appearing. If you listen to that, there are details about Melus of Bari, the Battle of Cannae, and the presence, the defeat there, the bloodshed of apparently hundreds of Normans that were already around as de facto contractors escorting Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land from southern Italy, from the Straits, from the brilliant sort of Portugal launch pads that, in fact, the Normans themselves would use later to invade the Byzantine Empire as their main target towards the Holy Land as well. Also recently made a video about Bohemond of Taranto, Bohemond of Hauteville. And so there is a lot, to make the long story short. Given that we talk about the Byzantines here, it's also very important to stress how the Comnenian era, that is essentially the one we will be covering today, if anything, just because everything happened within, in part also before, as we just said, but mostly under that dynasty, was heavily reliant on many Western mercenaries. Many of the Acritae, for example, that are sung as castellans, essentially, also in Anatolia and so on, and that we've seen also in videos like the Firenk, that is the Arabic term for essentially this Frankish and or Byzantine in that case, so essentially, broadly speaking, Western Christian, even better, mercenaries that the same Seljuks employed, especially in the Sultanate of Rome, so the Sultanate of Anatolia, of Iconium. And this is important because it shows you at the end of the day, and this has become a bit of a leitmotif from Schwerpunkt, the permeability of the East in general, in terms probably of political, territorial control, statal, institutional, robustness, and so on, compared to the West. Like, the West was really ahead at this time. It was really crushing everything. And there is the sense that, I don't know, but the Byzantines, look at them, all these aesthetics, of these pictures, these memes, and so on. They were so advanced. Were they? Compared to the West, because the meme, again, is said the West basically is the Dark Ages, and it took like the Greeks and the Arabs to teach almost to read them once again. This is, I don't know if it's not my personal opinion. Historiography has completely flipped this notion, and this is also sort of obvious through many indicators, not just the shift in trade balance, but also the same military organization, the military accomplishments of the Westerners in a moment in which basically the Byzantine Empire was ever more confined to its own, to Constantinople, in a truly administrative sense. I mean, it's truly center of power. This sounds more like you'd say, Schwerpunkt, this is not 1453. But as a matter of fact, things had really changed a lot, especially in the last generations, to the point it's impossible to unsee it. It's impossible to unsee the collapse, the implosion of the Byzantine Empire as a competitive force compared to the Latin Germanic West. Here, the Normans and their, in fact, quite vanguard function in this mechanism that does not get, in my opinion, enough recognition. Naturally, there were lots of sort of also reversals from the Norman side. It's not like it was a teleologically deterministic thing. But, of course, the Norman aims on Constantinople were pretty clear, right? And much of what you see in 1204 could have been accomplished by the Normans, but also the Germans. At the time of Henry VI, that died, like there is always this sort of curse that the Westerners were at some point always one step away from seizing Constantinople for themselves on multiple occasions. Also later, Charles of Anjou, and then the Vespers broke out. As a matter of fact, the Venetians and the French will succeed, but it was, say, historians debated on, was this to happen anyway? Was it just like a lucky shot or whatever? I have my own ideas, and I've never really made a video about the Fourth Crusade, but we will get there because at this point, right, we are covering all the key campaigns in medieval history. So the wars between the Byzantine Empire and the Normans unfolded over nearly a century and a half. It's not even this particularly long time, but they were quite intense. From essentially the first scattered arrivals of Norman adventurers in southern Italy during the early 11th century, to the decisive repulsion of the last major Norman invasion of the Byzantine Empire as late as 1186. That, as you understand here, is, however, less than 20 years away from the same Crusader sack of Constantinople. And as we've seen, for example, even in the 13th century Battle of Pelagonia, where Manfred of Sicily, so Hohenstaufen, as you know, the son of Frederick II, had been heavily involved in Balkan matters, and you find, in fact, at that point, namely it's in fact a Sicilian participation with knights and so on, but many of these noblemen, mercenaries, were themselves, like when coming specifically from southern Italy, after all, in great part tied, if not descending, as a matter of fact, from the also early Norman establishment that had established the kingdom. All right. In the 12th century, it was also a relatively recent thing, as we tend to think the Normans created the Kingdom of Sicily in the 11th century. Not quite, right? That came fairly late, right? Generations after the rough consolidation of all southern Italy and Sicily. That's, again, also yet another very important, fascinating topic, because there is all a local mechanism that allows for the Normans also to create what they did, right? And even though there is a massive shift, in fact, the nature of pre-Norman southern Italy must be thoroughly understood. Otherwise, it seems like these Normans also arrived out of nowhere, or just the land had been simply a land of conquest before, and it's not actually correct, which the Normans also found out the hard way, including fighting against one another as soon as they entrenched themselves in various southern Italian positions and, say, siding with the rebellious Longobards, or having, in fact, sort of very different views, say, from Apulia to Sicily, also just because of, for example, the latter having much more of an Islamic legacy, different, properly political scale of organization. All counterintuitive things that, if you are not familiar with the local history, you're not really quite prone to appreciate as such. But back to the wars with the Byzantines, these clashes saw the Normans originating as errant knights from northern France transform from mercenaries serving local factions into conquerors who stripped the Byzantines of their remaining Italian possessions and the island of Sicily that had been attentively sort of reinvaded by the Byzantines at different point in the previous generation. Think about Maniakes' expedition, also the same aborted one of Basil II. Before, by the way, repeatedly attempting to carve out Norman territories in the empire's Balkan heartland itself, right? So there are distinct stages, but it tells you how sort of escalatory the mechanism was just in some generations. When you hear mercenaries, by the way, that's yet another term that I never really liked, because there was much about the Normans, Western chivalry, dramatically engineering a self-sustainable system overall. Like when you look at this this war bands that, aside from the deep, rich archetypal and tropological traditional value of the same in the West, it's not like the Normans again were some aliens roaming around or simply continuing a Scandinavian adventure from the Viking era. No, there were something much more organically autochthonous and fully integrated and extra geared for the task, as most of the West was starting to be, right? From the Italian maritime republics that would also assist the Normans dramatically in this, or the Spanish Reconquista, etc. Now, the Normans' success stemmed from their military adaptability, in a sense, that was genetically part of these professional soldiers. It's better to call like that in practice, also because the clienteling mechanisms through which even a settled Norman nobleman in southern Italy as a vassal of the local lord and so on, vassal of the church, by the way, as you said before, that the Normans were not part, say, of the Holy Roman Empire, were technically holding a papal fief that, in fact, also brought to enormous privileges, immunities, and power of the church in southern Italy. There was an enclave, even property of Benevent, held by as a papal state, as a matter of fact. These guys keep living in that errant fashion. I mean, we've seen it with Bohemond of Taranto, that after all was literally part of the Hauteville dynasty, was the son of Robert Guiscard and was one of the greatest princes, crusader heroes in Europe. He married the daughter of Philip I of West Francia. We also made a video about the latter. So the West itself was established like that. We will surely talk about the passage from sort of war bands to knights in their still kind of pack behavior and so on. There is here a civilization. This is not a time for, I don't know, some simple sort of individualistic warriorism, right, that had been actually failing historically, because this military system was significantly more advanced than that, but you could see it even just in front of, for example, the Viking attempts at breaking through in the West, the fact that the same Scandinavians had ended up to Christianize and feudalize, even just through osmosis with the shockingly powerful core of Western Europe that at this point was literally overwhelming everyone. Like England, Sicily, was properly informing the Western Slavs, the Hungarians, the Northern Spanish, as we said, the same Scandinavians, and the Sicular Normans would be the ones who almost essentially broke the reins to the Byzantine Empire. And this submerged kind of quantity is perhaps underrated, because since the Normans wouldn't end up conquering the Byzantine Empire or Constantinople, still the sheer damage that they inflicted to it, the sheer costs, the staggering, the astronomic ciphers that the Komnenians had to pay in order to stamp their advance was by far, in terms of external threats, that truly constituted a big deal why sort of the Byzantine Empire became more fragile in relative terms of the West, stemmed from Norman aggression. All right, and if you want to make the point, actually the same French that stormed the Theodosian walls together with the Venetians in 1204 were, after all, the same Frenchmen that the Normans fundamentally were, together with this, again, broader, essentially post-Carolingian Western European dimension was all cooperating, and the later period, for example, we didn't mention the Holy Roman Empire, but the same Germans, as we said, threatened at some point in the second half of the 12th century were the bigger power in the West. In fact, also tendentially, say, at least more important than the Siculo-Norman one, yes, but in that sense, possibly also a threat on different occasions for the same Byzantines, right? Mostly the Germans and Byzantines tended to cooperate against the Siculo-Normans because reasons, mostly, again, the centrality of Italy, of Rome, and so on. But there are, in fact, the same Italian communes that participate to the Crusades. They actually contribute dramatically, always have the idea of the Italians mostly as the fleets, the sailors, the crews, the marines of the Crusades. But as a matter of fact, they contributed also with consistent land forces. So it's an entire Western, it's a Latin Christendom that is truly on the move and escalatorily evolving in a degree that the Byzantines probably did not have, in my opinion, probably the cultural tools to even understand in the mechanism. That was a very well-oiled, sort of robust mechanism, but that was, for that same reason, also less elastic, so to say, more crystallized, more sclerotic at the end of the day. The Normans, and the result, politics, moral forces, such as opportunistic alliances, the exploitation of, say, Byzantine internal weakness, big topic, of course. It's not like, for example, 1204 happened because the Pope woke up in the morning and decided to take Constantinople. Literally, the Byzantines that were fighting against one another called the Crusaders to Constantinople. That's bad, right? Don't do it, especially at that point in history. That's not how you work, and guess how it ended. While, in fact, in this sense, the Byzantine responses ranged from desperate diplomacy and bribery to actually hard-fought recoveries that ultimately preserved its role. As we'll see now, for example, I think one of the single most underrated campaigns in medieval warfare is Emmanuel Comnenus' almost successful attempt, by the way, at literally destroying the Siculo-Norman kingdom. And the Normans, they are literally were a step away from collapse, but they also reacted and counterattacked in ways that were equally magnificent, as a matter of fact, and really give you a dimension of their power. Now, the Norman involvement in southern Italy, where the thing starts, began modestly, with knights appearing as pilgrims or mercenaries amid the fragmented politics of southern Italy. There were Normans, and in the east, to an extent, in fact, that could overlap anthropologically even with the Varangians, that, as you know, comes from probably Vergang, which means like probably a errant bodyguard. That was not so different, in fact, from the same Norman forces that were appearing at this point. That would later, however, crush, as you know, at the Battle of the Rackham, those Anglo-Danes that served in the Byzantine Imperial Guard as well. But in the West, there is no doubt, because the East, in any case, is fringe, right? Places like Eastern Europe, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, etc. And to a degree, the same Byzantine province, because aside from Constantinople, just Thessalonica was an actual city. And so we are disproportionately sometimes forgetting this radical divide existing between probably the heartland of the Byzantine Empire and the heartland of Western Europe that was overbearingly more sort of populated, economically thriving, culturally, probably sort of more homogeneous distributed sense than anything the Byzantines or the Arabs, for that matter, had possibly even ever had, right, at any point in history, because there are not just great Hellenistic-looking capitals, right? There isn't just size, there is quality as well. Now, some Normans arrived in southern Italy as early as 999 for sort of millenaristic coincidence, even though those weren't actually so perceived as it was once thought at the time, nor, of course, this was necessarily the first time the Normans arrived there, just for what we can document. Returning, in fact, at that point from Jerusalem. And so they had likely also just passed through Italy in the way to the Holy Land, And aiding, in fact, at that point, on their return, Prince Guaimar III of Salerno. He was a Lombard ruler of the southern Italian principality on the Tyrrhenian Sea, the one of, the landing World War II and so on, against Saracen raiders who demanded tribute. We should also point out a little bit for the history of the southern Longobards, of the so-called Langobardia Minor, that those Saracens that we hear as, at some point they arrived, this Muslim pirates, etc., aside from the fact that many Saracens were actually literally Christians, and even in larger measure coming from the same southern Italy or Spain as opposed to North Africa, for example. This is true also for the ones that the Byzantines had to fight against. But many were Greek pirates, as a matter of fact, and they were Christians themselves. But also the headway that the Saracens made from North Africa in many ways was due, a bit like it happened in Germany with the Magyars, by the essentially hiring of these Morodeers that weren't, in fact, particularly more advanced than anything like Europe had at this time at all. Quite the contrary, as a matter of fact. In fact, to be thrown against one another. I mean, also the Carolingians had thrown Vikings against one another and so on. So when you look at this presence that was mostly just raiding, the Saracens mostly just had coastal nests for piratical activities. They weren't to colonize in a broader sense. North Africa was overwhelmingly less populated than anything in the northern shores of the Mediterranean. So it's important to see these dimensions and these quantities, because as Westerners, sometimes we literally represented these times, oh my God, in apocalyptic terms, in dark months, etc. But you underestimate normally the opportunism of local leaders, just because they were actually so powerful they could afford even this continuous warfare. Now, the Norman, there is all a stereotype, an archetype even, of the fact that the Normans, literally the Northmanni, the men of the north, were the great sort of Nordic, sort of more voraciously Indo-European traditional primitive model of conquerors, of divine stock, right? That's something that we hear over and over again, also from late antique ethnography, Scandinavia's the womb of peoples and all this kind of stuff. And there was something that the Siculo-Normans will ironically pay themselves later when they would settle in Sicily, where in fact the French and the Germans considered these Normans also with a bit of envy, telling the truth, given the overwhelming power that their kings had in compared to their own, in terms especially of centralization, local centralization, as Poulin, as Bataard, as people who had sort of promiscuously living next to the infidels, the Muslims, part of which had remained in Sicily even after the Norman conquest. This is a bit the same prejudices, paradoxically, you find in 1001 Night from Baghdad, say it is the center of Abbasid civilization, compared to North Africa. It is a bit always some sort of pagan land not fully converted to Islam and this stuff. And there was also that myth that originated from the Carolingian conquests of the Longobards back in the day in northern Italy, where the idea is, once again, the great northern conqueror that arrives and crushes these guys that are sort of softer, more Mediterranean, more sensualistic, more emotional, and so on. And there is actually much of that in the sources. We've seen it, for example, in the video about the Battle of the Iraqian, where a Norman historiography of properly Norman clergymen and sort of well attached to the oligarchy that effectively the Normans had become in terms of ruling southern Italy. Feudalism essentially was imposed to the degree it already existed in southern France, even though in a bit more mitigated way in a way, showing, for example, the southern Italian militias, they were actually extremely precious, especially in terms of technical skills, logistics, supplies, shipping, and all this kind of stuff broke in front of the Byzantines. As opposed to Norman heavy cavalry, it also had to sweat to win that battle, but still sort of drove it home. And for this reason, the Normans mocked, at least ideally, because it's references that you find in the sources, Lombard timidity. We very well know that chivalric ideals, etc., it's not like they did not exist or they weren't important for the men, but let's say we get a literary standard, and then unfortunately the voice of the people involved is not so kind of loud. By the way, the Normans had ancient connections with the Longobards as well. Think about Mont Saint-Michel, with the Gargano Sanctuary of St. Michael in Mount, in fact, St. Angel, that also connected a bit the rest of France and Italy through, in fact, the St. Michael's Lock, right on the Alpine foothills in Piedmont. It was all this emphoric tradition of the warrior saint St. Michael and the angel symbolism, something that derived possibly even from the East. Germans back in the day, the Gepids are the first ones to use that angelic iconography, for example, in their coins minted in today's Serbian places like, again, Sinjudunum and so on, that in Justinian's times you find also in the empire, spreading in the empire, and also among the Longobards themselves that had actually been destroying the Gepids at some point. So we should get a bit more into the ethno-anthropological ties that existed across all of Europe rather than these divides. But the sense it was the Normans, the French, in the sense of the Western Franks at least, were dramatically more advanced in a military sense. Today we don't analyze that in a strictly tactical sense. I'm probably coming up with something. But the idea is that the Normans essentially excelled in the thickly packed mounted cavalry shock charges that especially Western Frankish feudalism had been engineering from a very long time, and therefore had also been very deeply ingrained in Normandy itself after it had been given to the Vikings of Rollo. And that, if you really look at it, it's like they were doing pretty much what the same Western Franks were doing as a whole, right? So I don't think there is sort of heuristically efficacious way of trying to demonstrate that the Normans in general were better or worse, for that matter, as well, than, I don't know, most Western cavalry in general. They were the same thing at the end of the day. But the Longobards were something different. They didn't really have the same... This is true for the broader French. I mean, but this is valid also for... I don't know, the Spanish, the Germans, the Italians in this case, the English, the Anglo-Danes. They were heading towards some sort of feudalism. They were oligarchic societies. They were very sort of elite in many ways. And they had themselves been fostering a big deal of mounted warfare with heavily armored, armed and armored knights, literally, etc. It was a bit just the whole deal. But the Normans developed this sort of their own epopee, basing themselves, in fact, they were truly the best. And there are so many passages, quite famously also in the Alexiad by Anna Komnena that we read recently at some point in the video about no noble things other than sort of breaking heads and arms, which is how properly these Westerners conceived the privilege of being a knight and going at war and so on. And so Norman cavalry charges will become truly epic, right? The idea is that in front of certain victories, they would have kept charging up to the walls of Babylon, like the historian said. And on that occasion, however, the 999, the Normans mocked the Longobards for their timidity against the Saracens. They charged the Muslims and scattered them, earning gratitude that inspired promises to recruit more compatriots back home. So regardless of whether these are sort of embellishments, stories of some kind, with some degree of license and fantasy, there is no doubt at large that the Normans were among the single most overwhelmingly morally loaded warriors of the era, and that they knew their craft pretty well, especially in fact in something that evolved from a mere warrior in the realistic terms that had never really existed fully at any time in history, and that were at this point top-notch exactly because they mastered the radically collectively disciplined cavalry charges that were truly a matter of unit cohesion and sort of delivering this devastating cavalry charges that there's something that honestly are not less scary than even the horrors of today's battlefields. As a matter of fact, it's something that we tend always to downplay. In any ways, we know even in from more recent history what the psychological trauma of a cavalry charge actually is. Now, other traditions place early groups of Normans at the shrine of Mount Gargano, peninsula in Apulia, in 1016. This is where they encountered the Longbard rebel Melus of Bari, a nobleman from the homonymous city who led revolts against Byzantine rule in Apulia to establish some further Longbard autonomy, and agreed on that occasion to support his challenge to Byzantine authority there. Stories also circulated of exiled brothers from the Drengot family, fleeing Normandy after one slew a man in the Duke's presence, eventually joining Melus after papal audiences. The Drengot were essentially the first Normans to actually get an official sort of polity in the south, as we will see later. Now, though Viking raids had occasionally reached the Mediterranean earlier, such as the 860 fleet that deceived its way into Luna in Liguria by feigning a leader's conversion and death, these Norman bands marked the start of a sustained presence drawn by news of lucrative services against Byzantines, Longobards, and Muslims. And the Luna episode, famously enough, is also a truly Viking endeavor. It has barely anything to do with these Normans. Some of you will say, oh, Schwerpunkt, but they didn't differ too much after all, did they? They didn't, maybe in our own eyes, but in terms of those times, technical preparation, actual military performance, they categorically differed. All right, Vikings fought in very different ways. Not like they didn't fight on horseback or with heavy armor, but the structure of their forces was very differently calibrated compared to these Western Franks. And those were proper Scandinavians, right? By the way, that they weren't even the Normans from Normandy. That, in fact, at that time was not even a thing, really, because, as you know, it happened in 911. Now, this presence first manifested in serious combat during the Longobards revolt against the Byzantine rule that erupted in Bari on May the 9th, 1009, under the aforementioned Melus's leadership, and quickly spread to other local cities. The Catapan of John Kurkuras, the Catapan John Kurkuras, Byzantine governors, probably Catapan of Italy, so southern Italy, essentially from 1008 to 1010, died in battle late that year. But his successor, Basil Mesardonitus Catapan, from 1010 to 1016 to 1017, brought reinforcements, besieged the rebels, and retook Bari by June 1011 after the populace forced Melus and his brother-in-law Datus to flee. All right. Mesardonitus imposed mild penalties, exiling families but avoiding widespread executions. Peace endured until Melus renewed, however, the revolt in 1016 with fresh Norman contingents, possibly facilitated by papal Salernitan intermediaries, so other Longobards, essentially, because the local Byzantine subjects were actually also Longobards. It seems that Melus was even of Armenian origin, but he was definitely sort of Western and in sort of Christian. There wasn't the great schism yet, but sort of Roman, papal in that sense, in that orientation, and Latin in culture and identity. Engagements followed along the Fortoria at Arenula near Civita and at Vaccarica, where Melus secured control over much of Apulia. The new Catapan Basil Boioannes, one of the greatest Byzantine generals of the era, serving as Catapan from 1017 to 1027, countered decisively, requesting elite Varangian guards from Constantinople. There were actually some Varangians, some at least guard regiments in Bari historically, and these, as we've seen, had either partially rebelled or been dislodged, killed during the rebellion itself. So also the participation at the Battle of Kanahir, the clash on the battlefield, the same location of the Second Punic War in October 1018, is sometimes not necessarily anecdotal. It would have been there, but it's not like we know 100% what actually happened. And actually, the Byzantine battle echoed Hannibal's ancient victory for the rebels, so to say, but ended in catastrophe for them. The Varangians shattered the Longobards-Norman lines, killing their commander Gilbert Boiterre, and leaving scarcely a handful of Normans alive. It's said that out of 250 Normans, only 10 survived, including Ranulf Drangot, the Norman adventurer from the homonymous clan who became the first Count of Aversa, as we were hinting at before, in 1030, marking the start of permanent Norman settlement in southern Italy from Campania, the rich hinterland of the old Campania, Felix, and endured. This aspect is fascinating because Mellus fled to Germany, in Bamberg. They also recently made a video on because of the famous Bamberger Reiter in Franconia that was yet to come, but Mellus was buried there, as a matter of fact. We are at the time of the Ottonians, Henry II, like the later phase. Boianus at that point fortified the pass at Troia. Essentially, this was the gate from the Apennines where the Longobards had predatorily been launching raids into the Apulian plain controlled by the Byzantines. Garrisoning this location that was sort of rebuilt from scratch with Normans, right? So who proved pragmatic, fighting for whichever side offered advantage and ensuring prisoner exchanges. These guys were around in any case, and and especially as defeated, this is a sort of not much of a sort of Stockholm syndrome, but after all, if the wind changes, it's a bit like, I don't know, after the Battle of the Lech, the Magyars sort of changed their mind. They became smart. They settled down, they converted, and they were sort of a bit stunned by the Germans that had inflicted the blow on them. Right? So a traditional recognition of power hierarchy. However, this situation was continuously evolving, also because after the death of Basil II, in whose reign this had been happening, the Byzantines went through a profound crisis where the Normans of southern Italy began to take action. Pope Benedict traveled north, even after probably the Battle of Cannae, to confer with Emperor Henry II. In 1022, imperial forces marched south, so we're talking Holy Roman Imperial forces, crushing remaining resistance, imprisoning Lombard princes that had always been defiant for both empires and their sort of essentially mountainous hinterland. Southern Italy has very few coastal plains. The hinterland is terrifying, right? Executing Datus, by the way, by tying him in a sack with animals and drowning him. Normans increasingly operated, by the way, as mercenaries, attaching themselves further at this point to the local Lombard lords like Guaimar III or Pandulf IV of Capo. Again, the Byzantine presence was gradually evaporating, and what left was obviously like the local Lombard lords that had always been living there, also under, namely, sort of loosely under the Byzantines or the Holy Roman emperors. Ranulf Drangot aided the Longobards in prolonged sieges with his retinue, helping, for example, to recapture Naples in 1029 and receiving the county of Aversa in the rich, again, Campanian, very agricultural hinterland in 1030 as a fief from the same Pope Sergius IV. In other words, there was already like a complex alignment a bit between the papacy and the Normans, even though there would be actually some issue with them, at the detriment of the Byzantines. The Drangot enfeoffment was complete with a marriage alliance marking the first permanent lordship in the south. As we will see now, they will actually lose everything, and that's where the Hauteville come around. Also, the term enfeoffment is maybe too big. That's what was happening in any case in terms of, power relations, clientele dependencies on the local Longobards and so on. You also need to support, in fact, these guys with their own forces that are so great because they need a lot of land for their heavy cavalry, and so tendentially extending beyond like an average seigneury of southern Italy in scale. Naturally, the Normans have sort of earned this a bit with force. They have infiltrated themselves. They are playing a very dangerous game, even. The Normans deliberately balanced their support for the same reason, propping one side then the other to prevent any faction's total dominance and ensure their own survival and growth. Instead, welcoming, for example, local miscreants into camps where shared language and customs forge a cohesive identity. In these Norman retinues, there were also Saracens, as a matter of fact. And in fact, even we'll see, perhaps not much today, but the same Norman invasion of Sicily happened with, a Robert Guiscard, for example, being familiar, if not friend, with some Sicilian Muslims, for which the Normans had been fighting already. It was in the local clashes, a bit like the time of El Cid, that was allied but also enemy with different Muslims. And at the end of the day, we say Muslims as if everything was this sort of brown blob in the south, but in many ways these were still sort of Italian locals. They had sort of very different social-cultural, very different social-cultural physiognomy from even from properly the Islamic-controlled areas, right? And so that will help in a sense. These places were monstrously rich, but despite of the great idea of the Islamic Golden Age, telling the truth, the Muslim domination wasn't that thrilling, wasn't that advanced. There wasn't this enormous. If you talk about Cordoba, then we can say something was a real state. It was really big. It had a universal tendency, bureaucracy, permanent army. It was a pretty concentrated power. Same with the Byzantines. But if you look at, for example, the same Sicily or even North Africa, we're looking at scarce stuff, really, probably in terms of civilizational capacity. Unlike previous Byzantine Sicily, for example. I made a video on that. By 1035, the sons of Tancred of Hauteville, a Norman noble from the Hauteville-la-Guichard in southwestern Normandy, whose, in fact, numerous sons spearheaded the family's conquest in southern Italy, William Iron Arm, Drogo, and Humphrey, joined from northern France, bolstering numbers. There's also this very interesting migratory dynamic, especially as soon as some Normans were settled. The same will be for Sicily. It would be like a pretty consistent injection of sort of northern French elements, not just knights, but again, courtier, clergy, like you named them, merchants, etc. Now, Emperor Conrad II of the Holy Roman Empire confirmed, by the way, interestingly enough, Ranulf's status in 1037. Right, this is fascinating because we made some videos about both Conrad II and the so-called Edictum de Beneficis, the Constitutio de Feudis, that, as you know, essentially green-lighted the inheritance of the lesser fiefs, like these ones, as a matter of fact, because the bigger ones had been already allowed this by Charles the Bold with the Capitoli of Quercy, Suroise, in the late 9th century. This was a way, essentially, for Conrad, and you understand it better, this was an italic capitulary. So it technically encompassed, it would eventually expand also to Germany and even to France. So we saw the Holy Roman Empire was initially designed properly for internal Lombard issues in the north, having more militas siding with imperial cause against some sort of big local feudatories that had historically tendentially been rebelling against the Germans and so on. Interestingly enough, on that same occasion, Conrad II winks at the Normans in southern Italy as if they had been, because that's what the Germans had also always tried to affirm, that essentially the Italic kingdom, in part they were right about this, being essentially just the old Longobard kingdom, encompassed also the Langobardia Minor in southern Italy. That had historically extended also pretty far south, as a matter of fact, almost to the Straits. And so if the Holy Roman Emperor recognized a Norman settlement in the south, in this sort of no man's land in terms of major regional powers, because it was all a fragmented area which Byzantines, popes, Holy Roman emperors, etc., went just by proxies, including the Normans in this case, was a way to tie the latter to Holy Roman imperial power. And so that's how immediately the Holy Roman Emperor eyed these guys that evidently had quite distinguished themselves in the settlement. The Hauteville brothers gained prominence also in Georgios Maniakis' 1038-1040 expedition to reconquer Sicily from the Muslims. All right. Serving alongside Harald Hardrada's Varangians and Longobard contingents, I recently made yet another episode of my Hardrada's Zaga series already. The Normans distinguished themselves in the Sicilian expedition. William Iron Arm earned his, in fact, very nickname by single-handedly killing Syracuse's emir during its siege. At least the story goes that he emerged from a tunnel. He found the guy in front of him, and he literally struck, with his own arm, not with a sword like the guy, like with a single blow. It's beautiful, by the way, because they use also those sort of, old covering Ostbergs with the hand. And so this gives you an idea of also the anthropic types here. Some we've seen, for example, Bohemond of Hauteville, that was of the same blood as these guys, was literally a giant. Was enormous, right? So the idea is that, again, that there's this northern guy who arrives and kills in a single punch, like destroys entirely this weakly sort of southerner. Yet disputes over spoils distribution with the Byzantines led to the Normans' withdrawal before the campaign's inconclusive end, because, as you know, also Maniakes' expedition was some sort of exploit. Right, Basil II's expedition would have been bigger. The assassination of Catapan Nikephoros Dokeianos in 1040 ignited a fresh Longobarд-Norman revolt in Apulia, rapidly shifting to Norman leadership under William Iron Arm and his brothers. On March the 17th, 1041, at Olivento, a modest force of 300 Norman knights and infantry confronted the larger Byzantine army under Michael Dokeianos, including Varangians and Tagmata troops. Negotiations failed dramatically when a Norman struck the envoy's horse, and the ensuing charge routed the Byzantines, many drowning in retreat. You have here always the same sort of archetype that the Normans were just, dying to charge at every useful occasion. They mocked the Longobards, they were a bit more cautious. Here they probably say nuts to the Byzantines and overrun them. Now, barely 2 months later, May the 4th, at Montemaggiore near Canne, so the same neuralgic centers of Byzantine Apulia, William, despite fever, by the way, could you do that, led heavy cavalry that overwhelmed the enemy, inflicting heavy losses on Varangians and scattering survivors. The rivalry hostility with the Varangians was already a thing, just for saying how much of a different thing the Normans were at this point from the Vikings. And this will continue, as you've seen also in the video about the Battle of Dyrrhachium. That was literally the Hastings of Epirus, the Hastings of the Balkans. The climax came on September the 3rd at Monte Peloso, where intense day-long fighting ended with Catapan Exaugustus Boioannes captured and ransomed. Boioannes, by the way, speculated it could derive from Bayan and having some sort of Bulgarian, Turco-Slavic origin, because this Byzantine clan had been essentially a veteran of the Bulgarian wars of Basil II, and probably were local loyalists to Constantinople that eventually sort of made military career in southern Italy as governors. And the fact that Normans, the Hauteville, would actually overwhelm them, and with this sort of, this was a more intense clash, as you understand it. The intense historical and territorial stakes involved. In fact, after the Norman victory, coastal cities like Bari, Monopoli, and Giovinazzo submitted to avert raids, leaving the interior under rebel control. Leadership transitioned uneasily. However, Atenulf, brother of Benevento's prince, briefly held sway but was ousted for pocketing ransom money. The Normans, outvoted by Longobards, accepted Argyros of Bari, who soon defected back to the Byzantines after early gains. Consolidation accelerated through the councils at Melfi in 1042 and 1043, where Guaimar IV, Prince of Salerno, who sought to expand Longobard influence, acknowledged William Iron Arm as Count of Apulia. This was a major deal because this will remain one of the most important principalities within the future kingdom of Sicily. Marrying William to his niece for legitimacy and divided conquered lands into baronies that were modeled essentially also on the French administration. Ascoli to William. This is the battlefield of Ausculum, the Battle of Ausculum, the Romans against Pyrrhus. Acerenza to Ascletan Drongo. Montepeloso to Tristan. Monopoly to Hugues Tobeuf. Trani to Pierre, Peter. Venosa to Drogo, and Siponto to Ranulf, while retaining Melfi under shared governance. Calabria's conquest began in 1044 with castles like Stridula near Squillace. Drogo advanced through the Crati Valley, distributing lands and gifting his brother Robert Guiscard, the most famous Hauteville, nicknamed the Resourceful, who became Duke of Apulia and Calabrian-led conquests of southern Italy and Sicily. Strongholds like Scribla and later San Marco Argentano were augmented by marriages, bringing further 200 knights to settle. This is important because these lands had historically been controlled by the Byzantines, right? Even though they were Lombard largely. And so we record them because fighting here, it's very difficult how you can, who's a Byzantine here, what is what, right? In absolute terms here for the counterposition of the Normans and the Byzantines. But, right, this is a clamorous Norman success that seizes, in fact, some of the richest parts of southern Italy. Especially the Apulian agricultural base was very, very strong. All right, were historically the same fact Byzantine administration had remained sort of flourishing, the more connected with East, etc. At this point, Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, known as the Black, confirmed Drogo's titles in 1047. Again, you see these Holy Roman emperors that say, this is because obviously as the Byzantines were sort of shrinking, the Holy Roman emperors indirectly were benefiting of this, even though the Normans were unaffiliated. You have this title attributed to Drogo, again, including Dux et Magister Italia. This is a big deal because naturally here Italia doesn't mean the kingdom of Italy or anything like that. But since there was the catapanate of Italy, like here the Holy Roman Emperor was saying, okay, let's give him this high resounding title of master of Italy so that he will think more of us. And this tells you how anxious the Holy Roman emperors were really to co-opt the Normans. By the way, the better term is dux, which was not just used by the Longobards, but indicated essentially that, in fact, more military ducal power, in fact, as it's going to become within the same sort of feudal administration in general, that it's very appropriate now for the Norman warlords. Also, it's the same Henry III that authorized Benevento's seizure in 1053 at the expense of the Longobards. Drogo's 1051 assassination by Byzantine plotters elevated Humphrey. So you see the Byzantines are always in between with this sort of terrifying means. This tells you also, by the way, how messed up the situation was within the Norman front. I mean, brothers killing one another, which will sort of recur because these barons also thought that they were all primi inter pares. They were all primi in a sense according to each other. But there wasn't a real sense. There isn't a real monarchy. These are all some individual warlords settled in sort of different provincial realities. And Humphrey at this point was, by being backed by the Byzantines, you see, facing growing papal hostility amid Norman mistreatment of the locals, by the way, because it's not, again, the Normans were particularly sensitive to things like humanity or simile. So in general, they had this traumatically primitive and brutal mentality that they brought from their northern exploit and sort of co-opting the locals into forced labor, those kind of things. Again, feudalism was incredibly rigid, right? It was a thing that mostly in Gaul had remained since the times of the Roman latifundium. Southern Italy had not had that, in fact, since times like the Gothic War, and it's the Normans that actually put things back together, but in this sense also rigidly restructuring society in an incredibly oligarchic and, in fact, feudal fashion. Now, on June the 18th, 1053, famous date that I presume most of you know about, at Civitate, Humphrey's forces annihilated a papal coalition that contained also Longobards, Swabian mercenaries, those famous double-handed swordsmen, 1,500 swordsmen on foot, by the way. That still tells you how, for example, the Normans were truly a French product, whereas the Swabian, the Alemanni were still some sort of primitive from Central Europe in comparison. So here you have naturally the papacy Longobards had cavalry, the same Germans presumably had, but in general here it's a sort of more coalitional aggregation of forces that is for that reason mostly weak. Otherwise they could have defeated the Normans. It's not merely a sort of tactical reason, but here the Normans show their compactness, their power, and especially their magnificent cavalry charges. The Swabians in particular have themselves cut to pieces till the last. And the most important thing was, however, the capture of Pope Leo IX. By the way, the reformer Pope who organized the Anti-Norman League. I have really a pretty intense amount of videos about the Gregorian reforms. This would turn positively at the end of the day for both of them, because it secured, first of all, papal recognition for Guiscard as duke in return for vassalage. And so there was a moment of, the Normans will do bad things at some point. They will enter Rome and sack it during sort of the issues with the empire, the divisions of the city, etc. They were never sort of easy neighbors. However, right, the papal Norman connection here will remain fundamentally very strong, as we highlighted before. The parallel Drengo expansion from Aversa targeted Capua and Gaeta as well. So this Tyrrhenian cities, Capua is in the hinterland, but Gaeta was one of those old Byzantine duchies with maritime ambitions that had been very, also at some point sort of, Amalfi had been very much pro also the entire Christian alliance. Gaeta often sided with the Saracens as well. Richard Drengo warred neighboring Longobards from 1049, reducing Salerno to its city and incorporating Gaeta by 1064 through puppets after disputed dowers and debts. These cities were important, right? Even in northern France, like the Normans normally hadn't seen such things. Like, in Italy, there was a much more advanced process of encastellation. In this region in particular, incredibly tough terrain, but also lots of walls of sort of fortified positions. The castle of Salerno is very, just in an exceptional position. This was used by all the conquerors there, the Longobards, the Normans, and so on. Capua fell after sieges spanning 1057-1062, sort of big agricultural center, Roman city, historically, so again, important centers with princely titles assumed, by the way, in 1058 and papal confirmation in 1059 at Melfi. Northward incursions reached the same Latium, but were repelled at Rome in 1066. Right, quite a year. In the Abruzzo, on the Adriatic, this very heavily mountainous area, the hinterland, in some places, it's colder than Finland in winter. Post-Civitate advances, so Geoffroy of Hauteville take Larino and Morone. This also brings to reorganization of the Abruzzese hinterland under the Normans. Again, this previous seigneuries had never seen a scale like the ones, French model that the Normans were bringing from the north. Very brutal in positive means, needless to say. Geoffroy's son Robert formed the county of Loritello in 1061, conquering Teate and pressing Ortona, extending to the Pescara despite papal treaties curbing ravages after 1080. There are Molesan conquests, less documented, likely including Boiano before Civitate, expanding eastward and westward by 1105. It's a very gradual path here. Calabria completed its fall with Reggio's capture on the strait. We're in 1060 amid Byzantine decay, really. And again, we keep talking about this because technically there still was some trace or parvens of Byzantine presence. Doesn't matter how detached from Constantinople this place was, completely far. The Byzantines probably realized that this was another land, right? Latin Europe is something completely different from Greek Europe. And you have, in fact, this administrative collapse as well. Whatever had been probably imperial governance under essentially crumbling under decades of mismanagement, leaving emperors like Isaac I and Romanus III unable to reverse declines. I made videos about Byzantine rulers at that point. Failed rebellions in 1067, 1068 with financial aid and sieges of Otranto on the strait between the Adriatic and the Ionian seas, with the Venetians very, very watchful about this all. And Bari, the main city in Apulia, and another 1079, 1080 funding mercenary groups collapsed against Norman victories in Apulia. All right. These areas will keep rebelling even from to the later kingdom of Sicily, and so they will always be problematic. At some point, Bari would be razed to the ground, but it's there were lots of different allegiances at stake, lots of local resources. It was easy to have this autonomistic rebellions. Bari's prolonged siege, for example, from August the 5th, 1068 to April the 16th, 1071, which is a freaking long time. Normally, these things did not happen in the Middle Ages, epitomized resistance. All right. Bari was the most important city of the area. It had a fantastic port. It had this very fertile hinterland. They knew how, again, to defend themselves, and the rebellions, as we said before, seen before, to the Byzantine rule had started from there as well. So now with the Normans wasn't different. Defenders repelled assaults, by the way, destroyed a port blockade bridge, because the Normans were trying also to become truly maritime in nature, because the French ones hadn't historically quite been that, in spite of their Viking ancestry, and maintained sea links despite feminine plots with Constantinople. Relief fleets under Avartu Thales and later Stephen Patteran were scattered, with one under the Norman defector Jocelyn captured. So there were obviously Normans from the Byzantine side. All right, it weren't just about the Varangians. There were actual Byzantine mercenaries at some point fought against Norman mercenaries in the Byzantine army fought against other Normans in southern Italy. Internal negotiations by Argyrizus yielded the city, finally ending over 5 centuries of Byzantine rule in mainland Italy. Think about that, right? Half a millennium of sort of very feeble, intermittent, but still essentially present, intangible Byzantine dominion of these areas. What Normans really bring to southern Italy was political unity since the times of Justinian, basically. And so you can really appreciate the picture there since the time of the Lombard migration. Sicily's 30-year conquest from 1061 to 1091, led by Roger I, Robert Guiscard's brother, known as the Great Count, who systematically subdued the island and became its count, and Robert Guiscard exploited Islamic disunity after Kalbit decline and Zirid interference. The Muslims also were always quarreling with one another. In May 1061, the Normans crossed to Messina, Roger landing unseen overnight to surprise defenders at dawn. Robert fortified the city and allied with the Emir Ibn al-Timna against the rival Ibn al-Abbas. Advances past loyal Rometta through Frezzano and the plain of Maniacus, that bore the name of the original Byzantine expedition. Overcoming Centuripe resistance and taking Paterno swiftly, Castrogiovanni's garrison fell, but the citadel held, prompting winter withdrawal after building San Marco d'Alunzio. Roger captured Torino later that year. The Battle of Cerami in June 1063 saw a small Norman force rout a much larger Islamic army. Palermo was bypassed simply by 1064. Misilmeri in 1068 further weakened opposition. A second Palermo siege began in August 1071 with the entry of January 7th, 1072, and the full surrender days later. Roger became Count of Sicily under Guiscard's suzerainty, retaining Palermo, half Messina. Remember that, because of course that's the axis where they literally split the city in two, and the Christian Valdemone. because of course in Islamic Sicily, but most people were actually Christian, or at least in disguise. But there were some areas that had sort of remained more or less unmolested during the Muslim domination. For Robert, the latter valley, Trapani yielded in 1077 after Jordan's sortie cut livestock supplies. Taormina fell, that historically had been paradoxically the easternmost, so the closest place to the mainland, falling to the Muslims would have very intense Byzantine or better local resistance. But this fell as well. Very strong position, 1079. Catania to surprise in 1081 by Jordan, Robert de Surval and Elias Cartoni. Jordan's 1083 revolt displayed systematic campaigns until 1025. Syracuse, the old Byzantine capital of Sicily, was approached on May the 22nd. There was a naval clash 3 days later, killing its emir. The siege lasted until from summer until March 1086, when capitulation happened. Noto held until February 1091. So imagine the Byzantines witnessing to that and realizing we are blipped because these guys have now the greatest sort of the best naval position in the Mediterranean and all under an almost sort of unitary control. Constantinople really saw it coming. All right, and those places had historically maintained a great deal of connections with Constantinople. There were councils held for ecclesiastical affairs, even places coming as far as from Sardinia. Sicilians arrived. We know very few actually about those communities during the Islamic period, but we know that, again, there was some broader appeal. These areas actually in Calabria, Sicily, were closer to Constantinople than Apulia. It was mostly Lombard, for example. As far as the Normans go, treaties with emirs in East progressed amid hilly terrain and limited forces. Malta was subdued around 1091, yet another important launch pad, taxing inhabitants, but retaining at least Arab governors until Roger II replaced them in 1127. Roger II of Sicily, the first actual king. The other, essentially, traditionally Byzantine duchies that were, however, essentially just now Italian republic, fell later. Amalfi, that we made an entire video on, was the most Ostic because of its almost impenetrable geographical position, but we know that geopolitics does not exist and it fell after all, submitting to the Normans in 1073. Also through Sicilgaitus influences was the wife of the Lombard wife of Robert Guiscard, that we've seen also militarily involved in the Battle of Dyrrhachium. Salerno submitted after a united 1076-1077 siege, where Gisulf II's confiscations starved the citizens, leading to the December submission, May citadel fall. So that's the most important point, after all, for a more cohesive fight against the Byzantines. In fact, with Italy and Sicily secured, united formally as a kingdom only under Roger II, as we were saying, the Norman king founded properly the realm in 1130 by uniting all these various conquerors, properly claiming overlordship, one internationally recognized by the papacy and more. The Normans turned outward. This is the moment in which they became more dramatically pernicious for the Byzantines. And quite early on, as we've seen here, the fall of Sicily is basically in the 90s, but Dyrrhachium was a decade prior. Robert Guiscard, again, if you're interested in that battle, just know I made an entire video describing everything in detail, tactically wise. Robert Guiscard launched the first Balkan invasion in 1081. By the way, he didn't make any mystery of the fact that he wanted to conquer Constantinople. So it's as straightforward as it gets. This is post-massacre, so obviously things were quite delicate. We also made lots of videos about Alexius I from the other side, in this incredibly precarious situation, the collapse of the entire sort of statal, peasant soldiery, administrative model of the empire. At this point, the Byzantines are feudalizing, also under heavy need to bridge the gap with the Western institutional development. By the way, this invasion by Guiscard had as a pretext the mistreatment of his daughter, betrothed to Michael VII's son, after the emperor's deposition. Again, the Byzantines are not doing particularly well in general in terms of internal stability, which is everything in that circumstance. It's also obvious that the same Byzantines were trying here to keep at bay the Normans, like offering again the hands of their daughters at court, something that historically not even with the Ottonians had been possible on, in fact, German demand. But we'll talk more about those strained relations. Assembling recruits from Lombardy, so actual Lombardy in the north, and Apulia into a disciplined force despite inexperience, Robert sailed 150 ships carrying about 15,000 men, including 1,300 knights, landing near Aulon and taking Corfu easily. That is an island, fortress island. We've seen it also in our recent video about the Moran War. Certain battlefields never changed. And not because of geopolitics, but because of politics in any case, and the quite trafficked area. Advancing to Dyrrhachium, the key Byzantine port in, say, it's Epirus technically, but it could be considered Illyria, depending on the administrative repartitions, modern Durrës in Albania. Guiscard camped on the peninsula despite Venetian naval defeats of his fleet using close formations and so-called sea fire, which is the proper term for liquid Greek fire. I also made a video about that last spring. Now, the garrison under George Palaiologos in Dyrrhachium resisted. Some assaults with sallies, one leaving him fighting with an arrow in his skull, destroying a siege tower as well. The Emperor Alexius I Comnenus, the founder of at least the Comnenian restoration, had been Isaac, we mentioned him before, but he's also the guy who started the actual Comnenian regime, era, stabilizing the empire after near collapse, mustered on this occasion 20 to 25,000 troops, including Tagmata, Excubitors, Varangians, Manichaeans, Thessalians, Armenians, Turks, and Seljuk auxiliaries. If we split Turks and Seljuks, it's because there were plenty of Turks everywhere, like the Pechenegs, the Uzes, and so on. We made lots of videos about this. We've seen the Byzantine army composition pretty well in the video about the Battle of Dyrrhachium, and talk about the general campaign, Comnenian policy at this point, and strategy at this point. This force arrived to Dyrrhachium in order to lift the Norman siege on October the 15th. On the 18th, after Norman repositioning across some marshes, that basically was one of the most courageous decisions, because it was either you win or you die, basically, because you can't retreat as a whole army there. There is all a Michaelic symbolism in here, again from the Norman side, from the Anglo-Danish Varangian one. It's lots of very interesting things, including a bit of Nibelungen lead style drama with the Anglo-Danes burning alive in one of the structures on the battlefield, like against Attila at the court of Vienna. The Varangians advanced with archers volleying around. The cavalry failed. Normans charged flanks, routing one Byzantine wing. Pursuing Varangians isolated themselves and got massacred after the aforementioned church refuge was burned. Robert's heavy couché Langs cavalry charge smashed the center. If you read the accounts of the battle, you realize that it wasn't much of a further fighting. Basically, the Varangians were the toughest component as heavy infantry. The Normans had sort of trouble with that, but they outmaneuvered them with their cavalry, and the rest of the Byzantine forces and all the various nationalities, were the Serbs, the Turks, etc., collapsed at the quite orderly, methodic charges of the Norman horsemen. Here there is also Bohemond. We talked about this in his recent biography of mine. The Normans captured the camp as Alexius, wounded in the forehead, his daughter Anna describes of the scene dramatically enough, escaped, right? Betrayal at that point opened Dyrrhachium in February 1082. Apparently, it was a Venetian doing that, facilitating Norman advances into Macedonia and Thessaly. That's how the dam was broken. The Normans swarmed across the entire Balkans, southern Balkans, at least the Mediterranean region, part of it. And these were quite important for the empire that, however, was ever more dependent, as we were saying, on Constantinople, and could sort of re-extend at some point when the campaigns were over, and garrisoning the conquest was sort of a different thing. That's where the Normans actually failed eventually, even to maintain Dyrrhachium. Guiscard's recall, in fact, in 1083, 1084 to counter Henry IV's siege of Pope Gregory. That's where also the Roman incident occurred. We're talking the investiture controversy, as you know, Henry IV Thessalian against sort of he who will actually get his humiliation at Canossa and so on. Alexius had properly paid 360,000 gold pieces for this distraction of Robert, who, however, left Bohemond in command of the Greek operations. Bohemond won at Ioannina in the Balkan hinterland in summer 1082 by flanking a lured charge. The Normans were really masters here, and it's very interesting because the Byzantines were also pretty darn good at especially evasion and hit-and-run tactics and so on. So it was difficult to simply catch the Byzantines and sort of charging into enough mass to bleed them more seriously, but here the Normans were also pretty darn good at that. The same happened at Arta by outmaneuvering stakes with knights, slaughtering infantry, though a partial order allowed retreat. These were very tough grounds. Both sides were very worn out, so it was never an easy victory. After all, they suffered very heavy losses. Bohemond took Skopje and wintered at Castoria before besieging Larissa from November. Governor Leo Kephalas held 6 starving months. Alexius, with 7,000 Seljuk Turks, just for telling you how, who was the greatest threat to the empire at this point, not the Turks, but the Normans, and also using church treasures funding troops. That's how desperate the situation was. The Byzantine soldiers weren't happy, like some officers were accused of treason, so again, incredibly precarious balance. In spring, early summer 1083, however, a Norman visible force dared to attack, and the Byzantines carried out a feigned retreat, luring the opponent into an ambush. The Norman flanks were attacked, and the Turkish arrows decimated the pursuers like the Count of Brienne's knights. Here we find also names. I mean, the Briennes will actually be also involved historically, as you know, in the same Greece during the Latin Empire. They're very old family. We can make a video about this clan. The Normans were chased up to their camp. It's a bit like what the Turks had done at Manzikert with the Byzantines. They used shield walls holding hours before breaking to back and falling back to Trikala. Bribes in this sense were outmatching Bohemond's resources, forcing desertions and ultimately compelling him to withdraw to Italy. The Venetians, too, helped the Byzantines very much at sea. The situation started faltering for the general Norman IV. This war had lasted really a very long time. Guiscard died of fever in Cephalonia in 1085 before he could sort of come back and do anything consistent. Naturally, a major chapter of the Byzantine-Norman wars is the tensions arising during the First Crusade, where Norman mercenaries definitely aided the same Byzantine victories, paradoxically. However, Bohemond retained Antioch despite the oaths that the Crusaders had made to give back, essentially, especially that city, to Constantinople for many different reasons. I mean, Antioch is the cornerstone of Syrian dominion. We've seen also all the ambiguity there with the Byzantines, open warfare escalating. At least there were negotiations for establishing the Principality of Antioch as a buffer, but nothing really worked. Besides, among all these tensions, there was still the possibility, also from the Byzantine side, to relaunch an invasion of Italy against the same Normans. But the establishment of the Principality of Antioch, regardless of the fact that St. Bohemond at some point was captured by the Turks, that gave it back to released him essentially for a certain ransom as opposed to giving it to the Byzantines, showed how profoundly Rome, the political balance was in the Levant. The Byzantines had tendentially sort of tried to re-hegemonize. The Seljuks had sort of become the greater problem at that point, but there was room for maneuver still, as it also was proven by the actual capacity of the Byzantines to reconquer the Anatolian region at large, right, at the Turks' expense, but not much to make headway against the Ottoman states of the Latins. After John II Comnenus' death, Antioch, by the way, rebelled. This brought to the invasion of Cilicia and the sacking of Cyprus. The point is that Antioch had been held at the end of the day in some condition of power sharing between the Normans and the Byzantines. At this point, it's Manuel I's energetic response, extracting favorable terms in 1145, troops, garrisons, protection guarantees, curbing Turkic attacks as well. So in other words, it's not like the Principality was a Byzantine client state, but obviously was much more directly exposed to its pressure. And at that point, the Normans provided with some conditions, favorable conditions for the Byzantines. Naturally, there was a problem that the local church was not Latin. I mean, it was, but there were lots of Orthodoxes as well. At that point, the King Roger II of Sicily recaptured Corfu, where in 1147, this is a naval expedition that is very bloody. Like, there are very interesting descriptions of, let's say, by Nicetas Coniates and so on, of the siege, how the Normans assaulted the fortifications. Also, how they plundered Thebes in Boeotia and Corinth, in the Peloponnese, amid, by the way, some Cuman raids that were distracting the Byzantines in the Balkans. Manuel, at that point, allied himself with the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III. I made a video about his Italic reign, by the way, that had something to do with that, also with his policy in southern Italy. He secured the support of the Venetians that had become ever more toxic for the empire, but also necessary, especially as far as naval operations were concerned. In fact, the Byzantines managed to beat the Norman navy in 1148. It's mostly, again, Italians versus Italians. However, it's still essentially a proxy clash at sea for favoring also, we will see now, what will be the major invasion of southern Italy. At this point, like, both the Byzantine Empire and the Kingdom of Sicily are, like other powers around, very much on the rise again, right? It's mostly in relative terms there are ever greater imbalances, and that's why the Byzantines realize that they have to act more thoroughly against the Siculo-Normans, because they are single-handedly the most threatening power for the imperial existence at that point. Political divisions pitted the Byzantine-Venetian front, let's say, against the Norman-Hungarian one as well, because the Byzantines were launching some further reconquest in the Danubian Valley, even with significant success. You have also Serbian revolts that are triggered at that point with the help, at least, of the same Normans, thwarting the Italian reconquest plans from the side of Constantinople. Manuel I was an incredibly powerful ruler, recognized even many generations after his death for his munificence towards the Latins, all those errant knights that were increasingly settled in the empire. In fact, Manuel was trying, in a sense, to copy Western practices, mostly imitating the Siculo-Norman ones, given that he was very powerful. He said, okay, well, why don't you come serving me instead than the Roger II in Sicily? And this model started being actually competitive. Eventually, the Byzantines, after Manuel's death, sort of also because of his overall military failures, that were big, but they were not really so disastrous for the empire. But still, he had triggered the typical Greek xenophobia and Byzantine sort of rigid sort of conservatism, introversion against all these Latin fashion that were at some point instead accused of being the cause of the decline of the empire, rather than a potential model for inspiring themselves of some sort of reform to make the empire competitive. It's very hotly debated in general. I always advise to read Paul Magdalena's work on Manuel I. Manuel, by the way, managed to recover Corfu in 1149. This island was very important because essentially once you controlled that, you could much more easily launch expeditions to plunder, say, Thessaly, attemptably seizing Thessalonica, in fact, itself, and supporting in general a naval operations against the Piraeus and preventing the Byzantines from safely operating for example, possible invasion of southern Italy. George of Antioch's 40-ship raid pillaged the suburbs of Constantinople. These were Normans, again, they were all Hauteville clans historically. So from the Levant, the Normans had the capacity to launch naval raids as far as the Bosphorus, crossing the Dardanelles, etc. At some point, the Byzantines and Conrad III planned to invade the Kingdom of Sicily together, but Conrad sort of disagreed because the situation was particularly difficult. An expedition to Italy was always very costly, was already to do so in the north. You can imagine in the south, there was always the risk of Byzantine overreach. In any case, Conrad III also died, and the Byzantines basically would do nothing in this planned joint invasion of Sicily. It is the age of the Second Crusade, so admittedly that was another moment in which the Byzantines speeded up the crusading armies across the straits, not to have what would happen in 1204. The danger was very, very high, and the Normans were first in line to capitalize on that. It's rather, however, Manuel who capitalized on Roger II's 1154 death, same year, by the way, of the rise of Frederick Barbarossa as king of the Romans in Germany, as well as William I's turbulent succession. Roger II was by far the greatest ruler of the Hauteville dynasty in absolute terms of development. Of course, if you look at Robert Guiscard, you have sort of these giants, but Robert was properly not just the first king of Sicily, but the one whose reign was more successful. He made enormous efforts to reconquer, put together a bit all these southern Italian possessions of his, fighting in fact more against other Siculo-Normans than these enemies. And after his death, things loosened a little bit. There were rebellions, typically in Apulia. There was again the opposite region geographically to Sicily, also the closest one to Constantinople. So it was in a sense easier to play in both fields a little bit. Sicily was ruled in a much more autocratic fashion than southern Italy, right? Because the Arabs had not really left any sort of broader consistent government locally, co-opting powers and so on. So it was paradoxically easy for the Normans there to concentrate power based on a purely feudal. It was mixed also with local institutions, but mostly out of scratch. It wasn't much that there were great, bureaucratic or administrative models in Muslim Sicily. It was rather the fact that there was no resistance largely from all those scattered seigniories. It was rather in southern Italy that all those Longobards principalities were very powerful, very well entrenched in the mountains, created the greatest problems. They were more warlike, they were more, as you've seen, they're dynamic. And the Sicilian kings at this point used the iron fist against those rebels as well, and many Apulian refugees fled at the Byzantine court of Constantinople, Manuel being that munificent with them, as we were saying. These guys will actually fight in his own army. They were settled on the frontier as castellans. They knew how to make war. That was tendentially the ever more performingly effective mean to find a professional model. In 1155-1156, Manuel dispatched the Sebastocratores Michael Palaiologos and John Ducas with troops, ships, and gold against the Normans. This was a grandiose expedition aimed at properly destroying the Siculo-Norman kingdom. It was a massive effort, perfectly in line with the magnificence of Manuel's reign. The outcome would have been preferably some sort of power-sharing situation in southern Italy. The Byzantines did not really have the capacity to simply reoccupy the land. They had never really been interested in the hinterland. The Byzantines were all about coastal connections. So there would have been a power-sharing situation with the papacy that would have mostly profited from that. And the Byzantines also remaining a bit out, like it had been in the past. It was probably about eliminating, destroying the Siculo-Norman kingdom. This almost succeeded. Manuel asked the support of Frederick Barbarossa, that however declined aid against the Siculo-Normans for different reasons, also because he had big problems in central northern Italy. And the same Byzantines had been sabotaging him, telling the truth, in those campaigns. This affected barons, however, in southern Italy. Siculo-Normans, Apulo-Normans like Robert of Loritello enabled rapid gains for the Byzantine army, as southern Italy essentially rose against William I, some strongholds yielding to force or bribery. Basically, you have Apulia and most of the southern Italian mainland lost to this massive Byzantine invasion. And it's actually happening. The papacy and Manuel were even discussing about reuniting the church after the 11th century separation. It was just as if from a day to another, the kingdom of Sicily could simply crumble and disappear from the annals of history. However, these Siculo-Normans there showed massive attributes, and they launched this devastating counterattack both from land and sea from their Sicilian bases and the strongholds that they had maintained in southern Italy. And there is this very brilliant, especially, landing that the Normans carry out at Brindisi, so in the east, or like probably the heel of the boot, on May the 28th, 1156. These are all very important ports. Again, Taranto, Brindisi, Bari, Otranto, well, of course, Messina, Reggio on the other side, but still, like this Brindisi was, as you know, the Brundisium is also in Roman times. You study the civil wars. This was the port for, especially logistically connecting the Balkans with southern Italy. And so, if you control this, you could control properly the fuel, the lifeline of the Byzantine army. William destroyed the Byzantine forces in the process. There's incredibly harsh and brutal fighting, very confused picture, but still. And he managed to finally recover Bari. It was brutally punished. All right, just the cathedral remained standing. This was an incredibly violent manifestation with all the autocratic power of the Sicilian kings that reasserted their control over southern Italy. And so, as promising and successful as the campaign had started, this was completely crushed by the Normans. There's the Treaty of Benevent in June of the same 1156 with Pope Adrian IV confirming William's kingship of Sicily. The Pope, in that sense, that had been subsidizing the rebels, abandoned them as well, leaving them to the most raw and brutal Norman revenge. A revenge that turned also into an actual counterattack across the strait. Raids by the Normans, in fact, sacked Euboea and Almyrros in 1157. This was an important coastal retaliation that did not go too far because the country had, in any case, southern Italy had been devastated. Recovery was very much needed. This was an enormous victory to have repelled Byzantine invasion by itself, and peace between Constantinople and Palermo followed in 1158. There is a final large-scale invasion coming in 1185 under William II, exploiting Andronicus I Comnenus' unpopularity. Andronicus was very Rocambolesque figure, very fascinating. He was he created enormous problems, especially for Manuel Comnenus. He was exiled. He escaped many times, also from prison. He sided with all the possible enemies of the empire. He finally also came to power. He essentially triggered a reaction of the Latin world because of his massacre of the Latins. So basically he rose to power, and there was this great backlash against Manuel's motives of Latin protection. So the mob of Constantinople began to exterminate the Venetians, the Pisans, the Genoese, and so on, that had, as you know, great power and over properly Constantinople, and trade had their own quarters and so on. And this, however, was shocking. Like, Andronicus did not apparently order this, but he sort of justified it, let him run. And this, however, caused an international shock because basically Latin Christendom at that point ostracized any sort of Andronicus's attempts at continuation, and for this reason, the empire was engulfed in a major crisis, also with trade, because without the Italians we couldn't even basically trade or do anything. And at that point, Andronicus actually suffered this massive retaliation by the Normans, who, if anything, exploited the matter. There is a very interesting connection between the Normans and the various Italian maritime republics, because initially the Normans had sort of some robust naval power on their own, but after the feudalization of southern Italy, the local shipyards, the estates of the southern Italian cities had declined, had lost competitivity with the central and northern ones that were instead blossoming. And at that point, the Sicilians, they couldn't even quite stop very much that northern penetration in the various ports, had subcontracted, in fact, their ports to these other maritime republics and used them as contractors to like in this case, for example, to retaliate. So here talking the Sicilian fleet, but in many ways they were the same Italians who had suffered the massacre at the hand of the Greeks in Constantinople. We're talking really an enormous fleet, according to sources, counting over 200 vessels, transporting armies to Dyrrhachium. Once again, it was just facing alternative from the other side of the strait. You see, at that point, attacking the same Venetians that had protected you was not the best choice for the Byzantines, and Andronicus' sort of event is dramatic. The Normans at that point, because the Normans used the big guns, it's to say their own heavy cavalry, their own military organization, in advance with little opposition up to Thessalonica, where the governor, David Comnenus, reinforced the walls and assigned divisions inadequately, however, forbidding disruptive sallies, which was a bit too timid of a behavior. Only one Byzantine division engaged, allowing, however, for the eastern, for the easy capture from the side of the Norman and the undermining of the eastern wall of the city. which eventually cascaded into the Norman entry in Thessalonica. We are on August the 24th, triggering a devastating sack. Right, Thessalonica again was essentially the only true city after Constantinople in the empire. It's a big sort of autonomous thing. The Byzantines did not have, again, that Western potential of city-states or whatever, but they had, at least in Thessalonica, an important, also logistical hub and so on. I made a video about the Thessalonian army organizations in the later centuries. This was really an indiscriminate slaughter, claiming 1,000 churches were looted. There was an anticipation of what would happen to Constantinople in 1204. There was also showing that basically whether we're talking Sicilians, French men, Venetians, so we're talking essentially the same Latin word. The Venetians were a bit clever. They liked a bit more art, money, quality, and sort of they salvaged at least some great works that you can still admire. In fact, as a prey of war in Venice from Constantinople, including the beautiful quadriga of the Hippodrome, the lions at the gate of the arsenal, so all things that come from 1204. Thessalonica witnessed widespread arson and atrocity, shocking, for example, the local chronicler Eustathius, who described these events as unparalleled. There was probably a massive Latin retaliation for the bloodshed of Constantinople, and the Normans were very clever and capable of exploiting it. Panic overthrew Andronicus, that, by the way, according to legend, was properly cut to pieces by 2 Latin fighters in Constantinople that essentially played a game which one could stick their sword deeper into Andronicus' body that was torn to pieces in the process. These are the quite pronounced sensitivity of our Western soul, like back in the day, and probably still today, which is perfectly fine, by the way. And this also brought to the elevation of the Angeli with Isaac II. This will be also the guys who brought to 1204. That was yet another genial stroke from the side of the Byzantines, considering the outcome. Reinforced by Anatolian volunteers and Gold donatives, Alexius Brannus' army had been scrapped at this emergential moment, managed to rout a Norman vanguard at Mosynopolis. This Byzantine strike brought to the pursuit of the Sicular Normans, to the burning of the gates where they had taken refuge, and the storming of the same center to massacre the defenders, and in part had even sided with the Normans. Before, however, decisively engaging the main Norman force at Demetritzes, north of Ceres, on November the 7th. The initial Norman resistance faltered under the impetuous Byzantine assault. Leaders like Richard da Cerra and Baldwin were captured alongside the pretender Alexius Comnenus, because there were, again, still these sort of historical clans that wanted to come back again. Alexius was Manuel's illegitimate son. By the way, basically Constantinople was just basically 4 clans, right? It was a bit like the Roman late Republic in terms of who really mattered of all the various Okiac out there. It's always the same: the Ducas, the Comnenoi, the Angloi, etc. Many of the defeated fled, drowning in the Strymon River. Siculo-Norman survivors abandoned Thessalonica without fight. There wasn't much a way to simply hold it in that situation. The remnants were allegedly massacred by the Alans in revenge. The Alans were still a thing, by the way, mercenaries in Byzantine service from the Caucasus. They will, when the Mongols will arrive, you will find them as imperial bodyguards in China, and they were still around, especially in this eastern context. We've seen it also in the video about Roger de Flor and the Aragonese, the Catalan company. And on top of this, storms wrecked the withdrawing Siculo-Norman ships coming back to Italy. Tancred's Marmara fleet also withdrew at this point. It was much could be salvaged. The Iraqium also fell once again after Byzantine siege by spring 1186, leaving only the Ionian Islands Palatinate under Margaritus of Brindisi. So we're looking at essentially places like Corfu that, however, showed that how the Latin comeback had been somehow effective. And it will not, in fact, be until the Ottoman-Venetian division in 1479, right, at the time of the Aragonese, that this southern Italian control of those islands will cease. Also because the Byzantine Empire was destroyed in 1204, and they didn't have sort of much of a reason now to launch expeditions that far west. So a veritable era was about to end. In fact, also William II's hairless death famously plunged Sicily into instability. It would be his actual owned, the famous Constance of Hauteville, that through her marriage with the heir co-ruler to Frederick Barbarossa, Henry VI of Hohenstaufen, future Holy Roman Emperor, that essentially southern Italy, the kingdom of Sicily entire, was yielded to the Hohenstaufen. We are in 1194. This happened, by the way, because there was a civil war. There is Tancred of Lecce that actually creates problems that also had aims in that sort of troubled Byzantine frontier as well from the Apulian side. There is a civil war, essentially. The Hohenstaufen prefer to the Hauteville prefer to give the crown to to the imperial house rather than seeing in the hands of these local barons, Siculo-Norman barons. That's what you want to appreciate. Again, so old mix, also Longbird blood and so on. And there you have, in fact, the succession of Henry VI, who died in the preparations for, surprise, surprise, a southern Italian expedition against Constantinople, to properly capture Constantinople. We're barely 8 years before the Fourth Crusade, right? And if Henry had lived, likely or possibly at least plausibly, Constantinople would have been captured by the Germans. This is valid for the Angevins that take over southern Italy in 1266 and in the 80s are about to launch this expedition that the Palaiologoi had no means to counter, but the Sicilian Vespers, surprise, surprise, which is a Aragonese Byzantine plot, basically. It was the Sicilian uprising locally against the French that aborts the thing. And so at that point you have, it's like 1266, of course, that the Norman legacy had somehow ended, especially considering that there was also no significant ancestry tied to there was something, but not like it had been the case for the Hohenstaufen, that had inherited, in fact, that magnificent Norman state, right? That was, again, the marvel of Latin Germanic Europe at that point. And then you have all we talk so much about Frederick II, we talk about, not so much about Henry VI, for example. We should make a video about him. We talk about the Angevins recently. We talk about southern Italy a bit more often this year, and we shall do it more frequently because it's a very composite, very big land as well. That's what people tend not to realize, that this was literally overall the Kingdom of Sicily, the single richest country in Europe by the time of Charles of Anjou, and we have pretty sort of specific, an entire video about the richest countries in Europe at the time, and Sicily was even ahead of France, right? Sicily, southern Italy plus Sicily, of course. Now, the Byzantines, prioritizing survival against Eastern threats, abandoned Italian ambitions in any case at this point too. Not because they would have not been threatened from the Sicilian kings, whether Swabian or Angevin alike, but something that sort of ended the major wars in mutual exhaustion that we have described now. As you understand, they were a handful of however, very significant expeditions that you don't really see by the same scale and properly with the objective of knocking one another in other kingdoms to that. And that speaks of the enormous amount of capability, such as the ones that the Normans had showed in invading England, for example, that however sort of remained there, right? It's also more complicated just to invade the Byzantine Empire from southern Italy than, say, I don't know, southern England from Normandy. But there were also many resources at stake. And I'm really glad to have covered this topic because, as you understand, it's, also when you conceptualize it, it's important to ask yourself what kind of narrative you want to give to it, right? So, of course, there is a deep archetypal Norman-Byzantine rivalry that goes far beyond. We've seen, I would say, better in strictly cultural terms in the video about the Battle of Dyrrhachium, for example, in the video about Bohemond of Taranto, right? That hence we will discuss the episodes a bit more. But as you understand it, it's the clash not merely between the Byzantine Empire, the Kingdom of Sicily. It is really a clash between the Byzantines and the mounting Western civilization that is becoming ever more pervasive, ever more omnipresent in Byzantine affairs politically, and to the point of eventually of the collapse of the same Constantinople under the Western pressure. And this is the most important bottom line, I would say. And it's always great to talk about the Normans, to talk about this kind of figures. And sometimes it's difficult to pick topics. Like yesterday, for example, some of you asked me about Henry IV. It's one of my favorite rulers. It's a very interesting video in general, but I know that you don't watch it. You like the sort of the metaphysical drama, ethnos, religion, all this stuff. You have to understand, if you don't watch these videos, let's put it this way, you can't understand the former, right? You can sort of hear my poetic rephrasing of all the theological questions, say, of the ancient world and in our perspective and so on. But if you don't follow the history of the other of these people, you can't understand why they were what they were, and you can't immerse yourself in something that at that point you don't even know what it is, right? If you were missing values or references or models, it's not by simply imitating something without understanding what's at the core of it that is going to fix you, right? That's not how it works, right? I understand, again, the lack of fatherhood in the younger generation. I understand, I'm not talking here about you in general, like you're mostly my age, but let's say the collapse that we're witnessing in the younger generation, it's something that you can't fix by wishing to fix it. It's something that you must sweat, tears, and spit blood in order to achieve. And that's why also I'm showing you how to do that. Like, if you don't understand the rest, like, it's a bit difficult to pretend that you can't go anywhere with this. But here we are, nevertheless. And again, the channel has its ups and downs. It's completely normal. Just the more you support it, the more you sustain it, the better it is, because you can reach more people. This thing sort of remains better afloat. We have more chances also to make content just like the ones that I see you like when I'm invited, I'm interviewed. I also make video commentaries on other people's content and so on. So again, this is all really necessary in order to get what we are getting. All right, it's not an end to itself. It's something that you really must spread as far as possible, because from there we get the lymph to sort of improve further, to talk more and more about sort of the better topics that you're also probably more interested in, right? So we'll see how this one goes, because again, I make these videos and I think they're actually cool, but again, they don't get as many of the views as the ideological content, as some people like to call it. And that's, again, a sad convenience. Unfortunately, I hope with this videos to properly make the point of why that's the case, however. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.